This is Jennifer Reynolds, your armchair traveler, and I'm so delighted all of you have joined me on these myriad of journeys we've been taking around the world. I was born and raised in Canada, spent a number of years working for a Canadian tour operator, was dispatched to cruise ships in the early 1990s, spent a number of years working and living in the Dominican Republic, as well as Puerto Vallarta in Mexico. I've always considered myself to be a little bit more of a traveler versus a tourist, but man, I sure do love our world. Last year in March, I had a chance to go to Africa. I went to Tanzania. Shortly before that, I went to Africa. I have family in Adelaide and also in Hobart in Tasmania. But my husband, for a number of years, was a gentleman by the name of Dr. Stuart Nelson, an oceanographer, a historian, and, well, frankly, an all-around pretty smart guy. And he developed in me a much more acute love for history, for geography, for travel, for maps. And I'm just delighted to share some of these opportunities and experiences with you. December last year, I hit the last continent. It was the seventh continent. I landed on Antarctica. For any of you who have joined me on that journey, I think it was Saturday night we went to the Antarctic on Jennifer Reynolds Travels Facebook as well as Jennifer Reynolds Travels YouTube. Those journeys are available, our recordings are available, and collagetravelradio.com is also carrying our content. I live in Tampa, Florida. The love of my life is that 4-year-old little kitty on the right-hand side. His name is Alfie. He's not on my desk and laying on my notes at the moment, but my guess is he will appear at some point in time. But travel has been my life. It's been my world. It's been my passion all of my life. And tonight I'd like to introduce you to the Panama Canal. When I worked on cruise ships, running shore excursions for Regency cruises, and then later on Silver Seas on board the Silver Cloud, I was home ported in Montego Bay, Jamaica. Probably did somewhere between 60 to 70 partial transits of the Panama Canal, 30 to 40 full transits of the Panama Canal, and well, the magnificent part is I never lost my passion, because the Panama Canal and what it is, its perseverance, its adaptability, and its success. And history just seems to repeat itself over and over, whether we take out the names of the leaders or the country. So let's look back 200 million years ago and look at this landmass when all of our land was together in what was called Pangea, which meant all lands. And I'm guessing that's probably not a false or unfamiliar geographic concept to you. But over the course of millions of years, earthquakes, volcanic activity split Pangea into several plates, and everybody began to drift apart. And this goes on today. We know it is plate tectonics, and realistically, it's something new in the world of science. And when I say new, going back really until the mid-1960s, which was when I was born. But for millions of years, the continents of North and South America were not connected, and the waters of the Atlantic and the Pacific Ocean freely mixed. And it was 5 million years ago or so that the North American, South American, and Caribbean plates, 1, 2, 3, North, South, Caribbean, came together and converged. They created a tectonic uplifting, and it gave rise to an isthmus. And if you think that word is easy to say, you're wrong, especially if it's repeatedly. But an isthmus is simply a land bridge between two continents. And now, with the waters of these two oceans no longer mixing, the environmental characteristics completely changed. When you look at the Pacific Ocean, it's significantly less saltier than the Atlantic Ocean. There's creatures that live in the Pacific Ocean that have no business living in the Atlantic Ocean. Sea snakes, lionfish. Take a look at what's going on in the Keys these days. But the one significant thing that happened over on our side, on the Atlantic side, was the creation of the Gulf Stream. So what this isthmus did is it formed part of the Continental Divide, and that runs 8,000 miles from Alaska through Panama, through Ecuador, we talked about that the other night, all the way down to Tierra del Fuego. And now with the land bridge in place, flora and fauna had the ability to move from one continent to another. And this was the so-called Great American Exchange. About 12 to 14,000 years ago, humans appeared, and the accepted theory is that they came over the Bering Strait and then eventually made their way down through the Americas, down into Central and South America, and I'm sensing that it's probably not an unknown theory to you. So consider the Isthmus of Panama. At its narrowest, it's only 50 miles of land between the Atlantic and Pacific. Look south. There's Quito, Ecuador. Look a little bit to the west. Look at the Galapagos Islands right there on the equator themselves. We talked about those a few nights ago. For the Spanish, they were down here at this point in time. They were carrying mules and slaves, and they were going across the isthmus to the Atlantic side to places like Colombia in Cartagena. And Colombia is going to play a very big role in our story coming up. But in 1534, the Spanish king, King Charles I, ordered a survey for a sea-level canal across the Isthmus of Panama, Isthmus of Colombia at this point in time. Took 30 years, and he got a survey back, and here's what was shared with him. Quote, "If God had wanted such a sea-level canal, he would have provided it in the first place." Unquote. In 1815, the German naturalist Alexander Humboldt, and if you're thinking Humboldt Current, Galapagos penguins, yes, you're absolutely right. Alexander Humboldt published a study of possible ship canals connecting the Atlantic and the Pacific. There was 5 that he thought were likely routes, and the number 1 contender was Nicaragua. Here's something I thought kind of cool. Talk about being an armchair quarterback. In 5 years of traveling, in 5 years of making recommendations, and in 5 years of making 5 recommendations, Alexander Humboldt never set foot on the Isthmus of Panama. But there was some significant historical things going on at this point. By the end of the 19th century, Spain had lost most of its colonies in the Americas, but Panama was a possession of Colombia. In 1848, Colombia granted a concession to a new American company, and they were going to construct a railroad across the Isthmus of Panama. This was done with the understanding that the U.S. would guarantee Colombia's sovereignty, that they would look after Colombia, and it was ultimately agreed to in the U.S. treaty. But the U.S. said, "Hey, Colombia, I got your back." The Panama Canal Railroad was a publicly traded company. It was on the New York Stock Exchange. And the route that they chose ultimately was really one that Mother Nature was dictating, but it was one that would later be followed by a canal route. Completed in 1855, this route was the first continental railway across the Americas, and they made a bucket of money. Why? Because gold was discovered in California, and many of the gold rushers were coming through here in order to get through and up to San Francisco. But it was still known, and it was still understood, that a canal was needed to join these 2 oceans, much more than just a train. In 1869, 2 extremely significant events occurred. The first was the United States completed their transcontinental railroad, pretty much meaning the one in Panama was useless. The 49ers didn't have to go from San Francisco down to Panama to cross anymore. They could just use the newly built railroad from San Francisco across the United States. The second thing that was very significant was the completion of the 100-mile-long sea-level Suez Canal, the same length as the Rhine-Main-Danube Canal, for those of you who joined me the other night. The Suez Canal had taken 10 years to build, a cost of $100 million, twice the original estimate, and the lives of 10,000 Egyptian laborers. The guy who was responsible for the success of the Suez Canal, the man of the hour, was a Frenchman by the name of Ferdinand de Lesseps. Many French citizens, especially peasants and middle class, had invested heavily, and they saw the value of their shares triple. De Lesseps was 64 years old when the Suez Canal was finished, and he was a huge success. His wife had died years earlier, and very shortly after his success here at the Suez Canal, he married a French woman 43 years younger than him. His wife, gave birth to 12 children. Later in life, France honored Ferdinand de Lesseps and called him the Great Frenchman. I often wondered if it was for his canal efforts or whether it was for his ability to produce children in a woman 43 years younger than him. After all, he did produce a sheer dozen of them. But with the success of the Suez Canal, de Lesseps was arrogant enough to believe that this could be replicated in Panama. They formed a syndicate, and de Lesseps became the president of the new French Canal Panama Company. He'd never been here. He insisted a sea-level canal would do the trick. He also said they could do it in less time than they built the Suez Canal. That was 10 years, my friend. And you know what happened? All the French jumped in. They'd had success once, no reason why they shouldn't have success twice. They liked him, they trusted him, and de Lesseps' enterprise was off and running. 20 years and 20,000 lives later, it was over. As one writer would later characterize the French undertaking in terms of money. A third went to the canal construction. A third was wasted, and 1/3 was stolen. The French now were sitting on worthless stock. Ferdinand de Lesseps, who was once the toast of the town, was despised throughout France, and he died a recluse at the age of 94. But one thing history has always told us: where there is one man's sorrow, there is another man's joy. Enter Felipe Buenavarilla. He was a great rogue of the 20th century. He became involved in an American syndicate, and that syndicate was financed and headed by J.P. Morgan. He was clever. Felipe Buenavarilla was a French engineer, and he was a soldier, and he had tremendous influence over the U.S.'s decision to build a waterway through Panama. He got connected with the syndicate. He got connected with J.P. Morgan. And his primary goal was for the United States to take over the United States concession to the canal. To take over the French concession to the canal. So to that end, what he did, dispatched a whole bunch of American folks over there, and they bought up all of these really worthless stock certificates. Using their political connections, the U.S. Senate authorized the United States President to execute a treaty with Colombia, asking for a 6-mile-wide canal zone if it could get favorable conditions from the Colombians and the French Canal Company, which was now in receivership. So I'm thinking that might not be too hard of a goal. The French buyout was not to exceed $40 million, and if those terms didn't work, the U.S. said, guess what? We're going to go to Nicaragua. Felipe Buenaventura did not want a Nicaraguan canal. He now owned a ton of these really cheap shares from France. It was in his best interest to make sure that the U.S. went forward and moved with a canal through Panama. To help beat back the proponents of a Nicaraguan canal, he got a stamp issued. What did the stamp show? A belching volcano. And he distributed it to every U.S. senator and major newspaper in the United States. What was his message? Nicaragua had volcanoes. Panama didn't. Time came. The Colombian Senate rejected the U.S. treaty. Colombia wanted $25 million up front. The U.S. was offering $10 million. Teddy Roosevelt said, "I'm not going to pay any more," and he called them jackrabbits. The folks of Panama were getting a little tense at this point in time, and they were ready to revolt against Colombia. And Teddy Roosevelt was ready to make it happen, and so was Felipe Buenaventura. Felipe had an idea, and he cut a deal. He was going to serve as the intermediary between Panama and the United States. He would be named Panama's ambassador to the United States. Seemed like a good idea, and the U.S. agreed. Panama then turned around and declared its independence on November 3rd, 1903. Poor Bogota, Colombia, had no idea what had taken place. The United States officially recognized the new Republic of Panama, and it was open season. Game on. Felipe Buenaventura had done exactly what he needed to do. They'd bought up almost 80% of those cheap, worthless canal stocks, and now Teddy Roosevelt was committed to building a canal through Panama. One other piece needed to be put into place. Felipe said, "Hey, you told me if I made all this happen, I would be the Panamanian ambassador to the United States." The U.S. acknowledged him. Teddy Roosevelt said, "Thank you very much. Come on board." And Felipe Buenaventura turned around and created a treaty that was ridiculously favorable to the United States. He retreated to the Willard Hotel in Washington, D.C., hung out with Secretary of State John Hay. Instead of the 7 kilometers that was asked for, he requested 10 kilometers, but in fact got a 10-mile wide zone. Further, the U.S. Panama Canal Zone was granted to the United States in perpetuity. On the evening of November 18, 1903, only 15 days after Panama had proclaimed independence, Felipe Buenaventura, acting on behalf of Panama, signed the Panama Canal Treaty with the U.S. Secretary of State John Hay. No Panamanian was even present. Was not even present. I often chuckle when individuals say to me, "We gave back the canal in 1999. There are those of us that say we kind of sort of stole it in the first place. When the new Panamanian president, Manuel Amador, learned what had happened, the U.S. wouldn't reconsider anything. The deal was done. Panama was going to have to live with it. Felipe was obviously quickly fired by Amador as Panama's ambassador. He certainly did not have their best interests at heart. And Teddy Roosevelt had used his what's called big stick diplomacy and was now ready to make the, quote, dirt fly, unquote, in making the Panama Canal, and that's something that he was known for. John F. Wallace, a civil engineer, was the first engineer appointed by President Roosevelt. He came to Panama with his wife, and he quit after 1 year, overwhelmed by the task. The next chief engineer that Roosevelt chose was John F. Stevens, a railroad man, and upon his arrival in Panama, he put a stop to everything until he formed a plan of attack. A tough-talking, cigar-smoking man, he quickly realized 4 key things. One was that a sea level canal was an impossible undertaking. Second, the biggest challenge was going to be dealing with the removal and disposal of the rock and dirt removed in the digging. Thirdly, malaria and yellow fever, deadly. And number 4, the morale needed to be improved. He went to Washington, D.C., John F. Wallace, and he argued for a lock-type canal system such as you see in front of you, and Roosevelt agreed with him. It was deliciously simple in its engineering. Dam the Chagres River and use the stored fresh water. Fresh water wasn't really an issue since Panama gets over 200 inches of it a year. But the huge artificial lake that was going to be created behind the dam was going to be called Gatun Lake, and it would be 85 feet above sea level, with a system of locks on the Pacific and the Atlantic. Ships could be lifted and lowered over the mountains. It was going to be a water elevator. He applied his railroad expertise to putting in place what was then the greatest railway project ever undertaken. The biggest dig was through the 9-mile-long Continental Divide called the Culebra Cut. The amount of dirt, rock, and shale excavated was the equivalent of 28 of Egypt's Great Pyramids, and all of it went to form a dam. For dealing with malaria and yellow fever, Dr. William Crawford Gorgas, a U.S. Army medical doctor who had trained under Walter Reed in Cuba, brought his belief to Panama that it was mosquitoes, not dirty air, and not rotting earth that was causing the fevers. Stevens gave Gorgas total control. He combated the mosquitoes, and within a short time, the canal zone was one of the healthiest places in the tropics. New housing went up for the workforce, which was segregated, and wives and children began to arrive, and lives began to build. In November 1906, President Roosevelt came to Panama to see how his canal was progressing. He was thrilled with Stevens, and he was thrilled with all of the work. And then, unexpectedly, Stevens quit. The reason today is still debated, although it is very widely believed that Stevens suffered a nervous breakdown. The third chief engineer appointed was a gentleman by the name of George Washing Goethals. He was of the Army Corps of Engineers, and Roosevelt said, "He can't quit. I have appointed him." And he became known as the Czar of the zone. Goethals would generously and correctly credit the genius and work of his predecessor, John Stevens. But Goethals was at the right time and he was at the right place because he was an expert in organizing and building. The massive concrete locks are a testament to his engineering talents and gifts. And when the canal was completed in 1914, without a hint of scandal and under budget, World War I drew attention away from the opening of this great achievement. It fell on one of the ships that hauled cement, the Ancon, to make the historic first transit through the canal on August 15, 1914. For the next 85 years, the U.S. operated the Panama Canal on a break-even basis. The 10-mile-wide zone, which over time became home to almost a dozen U.S. military bases, divided the country of Panama, and it became an increasingly sore spot for the Panamanians, especially in the way the U.S. had obtained it all in the first place. As of 1999, transit through the canal is no longer through a U.S.-controlled zone, but through the very country of Panama itself. And tomorrow night, same time, same place, and same link, we shall do a virtual transit together of the Panama Canal. We've explored a bit of the rivers of Europe. We have gone south and looked at the Antarctic, and possibly in the future we'll look at individuals such as Scott and Amundsen and their contribution to history. The other night we went to Ecuador and the Galapagos Islands, to Italy and Venice. Tomorrow night we'll do a virtual transit through the Panama Canal, and in the future I welcome you to join me in Peru, and I'll share with you the story of my husband and Sir Hubert Wilkins and the story of sabotage in the Arctic. Sir Hubert Wilkins, the Australian explorer who in the early 1930s had a phenomenal mission taking a U.S. World War I submarine, re-outfitted it, and went to the absolute Arctic. In the meantime, my friends, our life isn't about finding ourselves, it's about creating ourselves. Watch a man, a plan, a canal, Panama. By the way, one of the world's longest palindromes. Taylor of Panama is a wonderful movie. Quantum of Solace was filmed here, which surprised me tremendously. I am an engineer's daughter, and I stand in awe of what is considered to be one of the most significant engineering feats in our lifetime, and we will do a partial transit together. Never underestimate the power of man. Read about South America, read about Panama Fever, the path between the seas, that amazing book that David McCullough wrote, a movie and a book that I highly recommend. And I simply can't touch Central and South America without thinking of Gabriela Garcia Marquez, who is really one of my favorite authors of all times. Friends, look up online. Go and visit the Panama Canal cameras. Look up the Kuna Indians. See what is so unique about this part of the world. Yes, it is about the canal. Yes, it is about the man-made things that are here. It is also about the opportunity now to explore the country more than just the canal, but also resorts and all kinds of cultural and environmental experiences. But tomorrow night, same time, same link, 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, we'll take a look at the rest of our world and some of the beautiful places that we can explore together. On my Facebook page, JenniferReynoldsTravels.com, and also my YouTube page, Jennifer Reynolds Travels, you'll find not information about travels as well as these videos recorded, and collagetravelradio.com are carrying our content and also playing music and sharing some pretty tremendous travel tips as we go forward. My friends, to travel is to live is to travel. I look forward to welcoming you on our virtual transit through the Panama Canal a bit later, and all other experiences that we'll have on our armchair travel experiences until the end of the month. This is Jennifer Reynolds. Thank you so much for joining me. #TravelStrong.